June 9, 1944. Outskirts of Villers-Bocage, Normandy. The fog hangs low over the hedgerows, pale and heavy. The first light of dawn pushes weakly through the mist. The fields are damp, the air still, a silence so fragile it seems ready to break at the faintest touch. Then it comes. A distant rumble, metal tracks grinding on stone, the rhythmic growl of engines climbing closer with each breath. A German Panzer column is advancing, unaware it's moving into a killing ground. Beneath a net of damp camouflage, a single British anti-tank gun waits. Dew gathers on the barrel. Mud clings to the wheels. Orders from command. Hold fire until authorization. But the men in this pit can hear what headquarters cannot. The sound of armor closing in fast. 50 meters. The fog shifts. Silhouette emerge. One gunner steadies his hands. His jaw is locked. He's been waiting too long. He realigns the sights by a hair's breadth. Unauthorized. Exact. The lever snaps down. A violent recoil. A single shell tears into the lead panzer. Fire and smoke rip the silence apart. In seconds, the column's confidence turns to chaos. In the summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe stood at a knife's edge. 5 days had passed since the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy. Utah, Omaha, gold, Juno, and sword were secured at great cost, but the campaign was only beginning. The beaches were never the final objective. The true battle lay inland, through narrow country roads, thick hedgerows, and heavily fortified German defensive zones. The small town of Villers-Bocage, nestled on a crossroads in Normandy, held tactical weight far greater than its size. It controlled vital routes leading toward Caen, a key German defensive anchor and an essential Allied objective. If the Allies broke through here, they could split German forces in Normandy, turning the flank of the entire German front in France. For the British 7th Armored Division, famously known as the Desert Rats, this was the path forward. Units had pushed inland from Gold Beach, aiming to exploit the weak points between German positions before reinforcements could close the gap. On paper, their momentum was strong, but the Germans had something the Allies hadn't fully accounted for. Armored counterattacks from elite formations. Among those formations stood the Panzer Division, one of the best equipped and most experienced German units on the Western Front, comprised of seasoned Panzer Grenadiers, Panther and Panzer IV tanks, and supported by mechanized infantry. It represented the backbone of Hitler's armored response in Normandy. The Lehr Division was trained for speed, precision, and crushing counter-assaults. The terrain around Villers-Bocage added a brutal layer to this confrontation. Normandy's infamous bocage country, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and narrow farm roads, was unlike the open desert, where the 7th Armored Division had earned its name. Tanks couldn't maneuver freely. Visibility was limited. Every bend in the road could hide a gun or an ambush. The landscape turned every advance into a calculated risk. In the early hours of June 9th, a German panzer column was on the move. The order was simple: strike the British armored spearhead before it could consolidate its position beyond the beaches. The convoy snaked along the road leading from the east toward Villers-Bocage. Panthers and Panzer IVs formed the backbone, supported by half-tracks and supply vehicles. Their assumption was clear: speed and shock would overwhelm any forward British positions, but the British were already there. Spread thin across the hedgerows, small anti-tank detachments had been hastily emplaced along the approach routes. They weren't meant to hold the line alone. Their job was to delay, to slow, to signal the main force when contact was made. Each crew knew they stood on borrowed time against armor of this scale. Communication in these forward positions was far from perfect. Radios crackled with static. Headquarters, juggling multiple contact reports across the sector, hesitated. Engagement orders were supposed to come through clear command channels. No individual firing decisions were authorized without coordination. In theory, this avoided wasted shots and revealed positions at the wrong time. But reality rarely respected theory. In one of these forward pits, a single 6-pounder anti-tank gun crew sat waiting. The 6-pounder, officially the Ordnance QF 6-pounder 7CWT, was a reliable and precise British gun. Light enough to conceal in hedgerows, powerful enough to knock out medium armor at short range. Against Panthers, it needed perfect placement and angle. At 50 meters, that was exactly what they had. The men in the emplacement could hear the German column long before they saw it. A faint vibration through the earth, a metallic groan rolling closer. The hedge ahead shivered slightly with each approaching tank. Orders still hadn't come, but every second of silence meant the Panzers drew nearer, closer to overrunning the position entirely. Behind that gun sat a gunner who had seen what hesitation costs. Trained in North Africa, transferred to Europe, he knew the sound of armor when it was close enough to crush you. He could make out their spacing, count their rhythm through sound alone. Higher command hesitated. The front line did not have that luxury. The decision point was no longer theoretical. If they waited, they would be crushed. If they fired too early, they'd risk isolation and retaliation. Somewhere in that fog-draped hedgerow, one man quietly leaned into the sight, ignoring the distant static on the radio, and as the column reached the bend, less than 70 meters away, the stage was set, not by orders from above, but by the inevitability of battle on the ground. By the time the Panzer Lehr column reached the outer approaches of Villers-Bocage, it had grown into a living machine. Dozens of vehicles, engines synchronized in a low mechanical roar, Panther tanks at the front, Panzer IVs trailing, half-tracks weaving between them. Supply trucks followed in a tight line, their crews convinced they were moving through secure ground. To them, this stretch of Normandy was still under firm German control, but intelligence was already outdated. The Allied advance after D-Day was faster than expected. British reconnaissance patrols had slipped through weak spots, and small anti-tank units were now embedded deep in terrain that German maps still marked as clear. It was the perfect recipe for collision. Not planned engagement, but a sudden, violent meeting of spearheads. Inside British command posts further back, things were far from synchronized. Reports from the front arrived fragmented, layered with delays and conflicting signals. Units were still establishing stable radio networks across the hedgerow maze. Orders moved slower than the tanks themselves. The frontline gun positions, the last link in this chain, waited for green lights that came too late, if they came at all. In Normandy, battles weren't always decided by grand strategy. They were decided by the men in mud, staring down steel they could hear before they could see. The emplacement in question sat at a sharp curve on a narrow road just north of the town. High hedgerows flanked the lane like natural fortress walls, funneling vehicles into a predictable path. This was no accident. British engineers and infantry units had chosen this site specifically because it offered what little advantage could be found against superior armor: control over line of sight and range. At 50 to 70 meters, even a 6-pounder could punch through a Panzer's lower frontal armor or its vulnerable sides. The gun itself was modest in appearance, but deadly in the right hands. The Ordnance QF 6-pounder, introduced in 1942, fired a 57mm shell at high velocity. Against older Panzer III and IV tanks, it was brutally effective. Against Panthers, it required nerve and precision. At this distance, accuracy wasn't the problem. Timing was. A single misjudged shot could bring down the fury of the entire column. Official British doctrine was clear. No gunner was to open fire without explicit command. The logic was rooted in discipline: conserving ammunition, coordinating ambushes, ensuring artillery and infantry moved as one. In open battlefields, that logic held. But Normandy was not an open battlefield. Here, decisions lived or died in seconds. The Panzer Lehr Division, on the other hand, was moving with calculated boldness. They were veterans of Kursk and the Eastern Front, accustomed to sweeping mechanized maneuvers. They knew British forces were advancing but underestimated their depth and forward positioning. The Germans believed that speed, armor, and shock would overpower any scattered forward units. Their confidence, forged in years of mechanized warfare, left them vulnerable in the tight Norman lanes where a single gun could dominate a choke point. In that dugout, the anti-tank crew could now see the silhouettes emerging from the mist. One by one, dark outlines of tanks slid through the hedge line like predators in a forest. First the lead Panther, then another. The road allowed no wide formation, only a column. The tanks were close enough that the men could smell the exhaust, a bitter metallic sting cutting through the damp air. They waited for a signal that wasn't coming. The field telephone had gone silent. The radio crackled with distant interference. In that moment, command existed only on paper. The reality belonged to the crew. The gunner's decision was not born out of defiance. It was survival, drilled into instinct over years of combat. He had served in the desert, where German armor moved fast and hit hard. There, he'd learned the cost of hesitation. A delayed shot meant your gun position would be flattened before you could reload. He lowered his cheek against the cold metal of the sight. The first tank's flank turned slightly as it negotiated the bend. Perfect angle, perfect range. Still no order. His sergeant hesitated. The rest of the crew exchanged short, tight glances. But one man, the gunner, made the call no one else could. His finger brushed the firing lever. The stage wasn't set by strategy or radio. It was set by instinct, terrain, and the rhythm of advancing steel. And in seconds, that unauthorized pull would ignite one of the most decisive small unit actions on that stretch of Normandy's front. War is made of moments measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats. The man behind the 6-pounder gun wasn't a name that would ever appear in grand strategy papers. He was one of hundreds of trained British gunners, ordinary soldiers tasked with holding the line against extraordinary force. He had seen battle before. In North Africa, in the endless sand and open sky, he'd learned that hesitation was fatal. German armor didn't wait. Panzers struck fast, their 75mm guns tearing through soft defenses like paper. Survival meant reacting a second earlier than the enemy expected. In Normandy, he wasn't in the open desert anymore, but the lesson had burned into him too deep to forget. In that sunken lane, surrounded by hedgerows and fog, he wasn't disobeying out of arrogance. He was acting because silence meant death. His breath was controlled, not panicked. His finger didn't tremble. Around him, the rest of the crew, loader, spotter, assistant, exchanged no words. They had drilled this scenario countless times. One aim, one shot, one chance. He wasn't a hero in that moment. He was a soldier doing the only thing that made sense when everything else froze. This was the human core of that action. One man's instinct, forged through war, colliding with the rigid machinery of command. On paper, the British defensive plan was cautious, even elegant. Anti-tank guns were to hold fire until the German column was fully committed. Only then would they strike, catching as many tanks as possible in the kill zone. By coordinating multiple positions, they could overwhelm the panzers in a synchronized ambush. But that depended on synchronized timing. And timing was what Normandy rarely allowed. Communications were slow. The terrain was fragmented. Crews couldn't always rely on orders arriving in time. The tactical doctrine clashed with the battlefield's reality. If the lead tank passed their position, the element of surprise would be gone. Worse, the gun would be exposed to the rear elements of the column, unable to traverse fast enough. It would be crushed before firing a second round. The unauthorized firing wasn't reckless. It was tactically sound. By hitting the lead vehicle at the bend, the gunner blocked the entire road. The narrow lane offered no bypass. The rest of the column would be forced into a bottleneck, trapped, vulnerable, and disoriented. One shot in the right place could unravel a formation built on momentum. The weapon that set the trap that morning was no monster of steel, no massive artillery piece or towering tank. It was a British Ordnance QF 6-pounder anti-tank gun, compact and efficient, a product of necessity. Introduced in 1942, the 6-pounder had become the workhorse of British infantry anti-tank units by 1944. Weighing just over 2,100 kilograms, it was light enough to be manhandled into position, yet capable of punching through 60-80 millimeters of armor at short range with standard AP rounds. Against a Panzer IV, it was more than enough. Against a Panther, with its sloped frontal armor, it demanded precision. The gun's advantage was concealability and angle of fire. Its low silhouette could hide behind hedgerows or sunken lanes. At the kind of ranges Normandy's terrain forced upon both sides, often under 100 meters, its lack of sheer power mattered less. At that distance, armor vulnerabilities became painfully real. The gun crew had positioned it at the bend of the road deliberately. The barrel was set at a narrow arc, aimed where any tank would have to slow and turn slightly, momentarily exposing its thinner side armor. It wasn't brute force that would decide the engagement. It was geometry, timing, and engineering. The Germans had designed the Panther for frontal superiority, not close-quarter choke points. That morning, the battlefield turned their strength into a weakness. The Panzer Lehr column moved as it had been trained to, fast, organized, and with confidence. Panther tanks at the front, Panzer IVs and half-tracks behind. These men were veterans. Many had fought at Kursk, on the Eastern Front, against Soviet waves. Their doctrine favored rapid advances, punching through enemy positions with armored wedges. But Normandy was no Eastern Front. The Bocage country negated much of their speed. The roads were narrow, bordered by earthen embankments and thick hedgerows. Tanks couldn't fan out. Their flanks were locked in by nature itself. If the lead tank was hit, the column couldn't maneuver. The second vehicle couldn't push forward without ramming the wreck. The third couldn't bypass either. This created a perfect kill box. Not because the British had overwhelming firepower, but because the terrain funneled a powerful armored formation into a single vulnerable path. The Germans had also underestimated Allied depth. They believed forward units would pull back or wait for larger formations. That arrogance, born of countless past victories, made the ambush all the more devastating. In their minds, there was no single gun waiting. There was just empty road, until the first shell hit. Battlefield obedience is the foundation of any army. Orders maintain discipline. But war is also made of moments where a single soldier decides to act without permission, because permission comes too late. The gunner's action that morning was unauthorized. By the book, he broke the chain of command. But by reality's harsh standard, his decision saved the position. He forced the German column to stop cold. He bought the division time. This moment sits at the intersection of regulation and instinct, where wars are often won or lost. Had he waited for the signal, the Panzer column might have rolled through unopposed, flanking British positions and tightening the German grip on Villers-Bocage. Instead, a single pull of a firing lever rewrote the course of that sector's battle. Not all acts of war are heroic. Some are simply necessary. The first shell left the barrel with a sharp metallic crack, a sound that cut through the mist like lightning splitting open a storm. In that split second, the gunner's world shrank to the sight picture in front of him. There was no radio chatter now, no hesitation. Just the line between his barrel and the lead Panther tank rolling through the bend. The armor-piercing round struck the lower right side of the lead tank's glacis plate, right where the angle softened during the turn. The explosion wasn't cinematic. It was brutally real. A flash of sparks, a burst of smoke, a shudder through the steel giant as if it had inhaled a punch. Then the tank lurched to a dead stop. Its tracks clanked uselessly as the engine seized. Flames began to crawl out from beneath the hull. In an instant, the narrow road, once a smooth artery for German armor, became a sealed trap. The second Panther, moving close behind, slammed on its brakes, grinding against the wreck ahead. The column behind bunched up like a steel serpent recoiling on itself. Drivers shouted, engines rev-ed, but there was nowhere to go. The gunner didn't look up to admire his shot. He already knew where the next round would go. Load! The only word spoken, quick, precise. The loader was already sliding the second shell into the breech. The 6-pounder barked again. The second round slammed into the frontal sprocket assembly of the next tank in line. Not enough to destroy it outright, but enough to jam its movement and trap it behind the burning lead vehicle. 2 Panthers disabled, the rest immobilized by their own formation. Panzers were built to dominate open ground, to maneuver, to crush through lines. But here, in this narrow sunken lane, they were as vulnerable as cattle in a chute. Infantry leapt from half-tracks, scrambling for cover. Tank commanders yelled orders into their headsets, their confidence dissolving into a rising panic. The gunner fired a third shot, this time angling lower. A Panzer IV caught it mid-turret ring, the weak point between hull and turret. The shell punched through, detonating inside. Flames burst out of the commander's hatch, a column of black smoke twisting into the morning air. The sound of German armor advancing turned into the sound of German armor dying. Grinding gears, ruptured metal, detonating ammunition, and the shouts of men caught inside burning machines. But the moment wasn't one-sided. German gunners regained their senses. The third tank in line traversed its turret toward the muzzle flash in the hedge line. A bright orange streak cut through the fog, a high-velocity shell passing just meters over the emplacement. The gun crew felt the blast pressure wash over them, knocking leaves and dust into their faces. The gunner crouched low, adjusting elevation. Another round slid into the breech. The loader's hands were moving faster now, instinct taking over. Their world had narrowed to seconds. The Germans tried to back up the second tank, but the tight spacing and jammed tracks turned their column into a trapped convoy. The next shot hit the second Panther again. A precision strike into the flank plate. The armor gave way with a loud metallic crack. Flames engulfed the vehicle as ammunition cooked off inside, turning the tank into a furnace. 4 shells. 3 tanks neutralized. A column that minutes earlier had been an unstoppable spearhead was now a burning barricade, and in the center of it all, one unauthorized decision held the line. The fog began to scatter as the sun climbed. What it revealed was chaos. The road that moments ago carried the proud advance of the Panzer Lehr Division now resembled a graveyard of steel. 2 Panthers blocked the front like fallen giants. A Panzer IV burned in the middle, its hatches glowing with heat. Flames licked upward through the hedgerow canopy, casting flickering light across the lane. The gunner and his crew barely had time to breathe. The German response was fast, disciplined, but desperate. Infantry dismounted from their half-tracks, diving into ditches on both sides of the road. Machine guns cracked through the hedges. A German tank at the rear of the column tried to angle its turret down the narrow corridor toward the muzzle flash that had torn their advance apart. But the British gun crew had chosen their position well. The guns sat in a concealed embrasure, offset from the road's axis. Direct return fire was awkward. The German gunners' view was partially obscured by wrecked vehicles, smoke, and the bend itself. Their powerful 75 mm 20 Cook guns were useless if they couldn't line up a clean shot. Traverse. The gunner and his crew shifted their aim to the 4th tank in line. The loader's arms were slick with mud and sweat as he slammed another 6-pounder round into the breech. The barrel steadied. The next shot ripped into the exposed flank of a Panzer IV trying to maneuver around the smoking wreck ahead. A clean penetration. Another plume of fire. The road was now a kill box. Every vehicle behind the front wreck was trapped by those ahead of it. Each burning tank became a wall. The Germans could neither push forward nor retreat without exposing their rears to the hedgerows. The return fire intensified. Rounds ripped through the hedge line, splintering wood and tearing through earth. One shell detonated close, too close, showering the crew with soil and debris. The assistant gunner's ear was ringing, a warm trickle of blood down his cheek, but the gun itself held firm. The Germans then shifted tactics. Infantry crept along the ditch line, hoping to flank the position and neutralize the gun. But the gunner had anticipated it. This was Normandy. Every hedge concealed danger. Allied infantry positioned nearby opened fire, pinning down the advancing Germans. The firing pattern was now deliberate, not desperate. First the lead tank, then the choke point, then any vehicle attempting to bypass. The gunner wasn't spraying shots. He was cutting down the column with surgical precision, an unauthorized sequence that effectively mirrored trained ambush doctrine, executed without waiting for higher command. As the fight dragged on, the German formation fractured. Radios blared contradictory orders. Some tried to back out, others to push through the burning wrecks. A Panther at the rear reversed too hard and slipped partially into a drainage ditch, jamming its own escape. Within 20 minutes, what had been a disciplined armored column became a stalled, smoking convoy, exposed and vulnerable to artillery and infantry assault. The single gun had done more than slow the advance. It had frozen it in place. British units nearby, initially unaware of what was unfolding, could now hear the echoes of battle. They saw the smoke rising over the bocage. Reinforcements moved in, not to fight for survival, but to exploit the damage already done by one decisive act. At the heart of the chaos, the gunner steadied his breathing, checked his remaining rounds, and realigned his sights. The battle had shifted. The German advance wasn't just slowed, it was broken. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over the hedgerows, the road north of Villers-Bocage no longer looked like a route of advance. It looked like a graveyard of armor. The lead Panther still smoldered where it had been hit, its engine compartment burning steadily as black smoke drifted upward. Two more tanks sat disabled behind it, their turrets frozen at awkward angles, steel carcasses blocking every inch of the lane. The Panzerbeifahrer, struck mid-column, burned hotter than the rest, ammunition having detonated in a chain reaction that blackened the surrounding hedges and shattered a nearby fence line. What had been a proud armored spearhead of the Panzer Lehr Division, veteran soldiers, elite equipment, and German confidence, was reduced to wrecks scattered over less than 200 meters of road. The narrowness of the lane, the bend, and the rising hedgerows that once offered protection had become a death trap of their own making. German infantry tried to regroup in the ditches, but they no longer had armor to shield them. The burning tanks radiated heat, turned the air thick with smoke and oil, and left their crews disoriented. Retreating was slow. The rear vehicles struggled to reverse in such a cramped formation. Some were abandoned altogether. For the British, the sound of the engagement traveled faster than any radio report. Within minutes, forward infantry patrols of the 7th Armored Division began moving toward the smoke. What they encountered was not a battlefield in the making, it was a battlefield already decided. The gun crew, still in their pit, were covered in soot, mud, and smoke. The barrel of their 6-pounder was hot to the touch. They had fired carefully, methodically. Each round counted. This wasn't a sustained artillery barrage. It was an ambush measured in precision, and the result was staggering. 4 tanks destroyed outright, several more disabled. The entire German column immobilized. The attack, designed to punch through British forward positions and regain initiative, had stalled completely. Villers-Bocage, a key road junction in the Normandy theater, remained under British control that morning. Reinforcements fanned out through nearby lanes, establishing secondary ambush points and securing the flanks. German plans to push deeper toward the beaches were thrown off balance, forcing their command to redirect units and delay movement, buying the Allies critical time to fortify positions inland. Nearby, infantrymen passing the scene stopped briefly, staring at the wreckage. The German tanks were legendary, their reputation carried from the Eastern Front. To see them stacked and burning in a single narrow lane was both shocking and deeply motivating. Behind the front line, headquarters was still piecing together what exactly had happened. The engagement hadn't been part of a larger plan. There had been no synchronized order to fire, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. One gun crew, acting without command, had cut the head off a German armored thrust. When the full scale of what had happened reached British headquarters, the initial reaction wasn't celebration, it was disbelief. There had been no planned engagement scheduled for that stretch of the road. No coordinated signal to fire. Yet an entire German armored column had been halted, shattered, and left smoldering in less than half an hour. The radio logs showed nothing. The command net had been jammed with other reports that morning. According to the plan, the gun should never have fired when it did. But standing in the command tent and looking at the situation map, British officers saw the result. A critical German thrust, blunted without committing their own main armored elements. Reports filtered in from forward observers and infantry patrols. 4 tanks destroyed outright, at least 3 more disabled, supply vehicles abandoned, and dozens of infantry scattered in disarray. The destruction of the column forced German commanders to pull back and reorganize, losing the momentum they had counted on to push toward the beachhead. This single action, born not of orders, but of initiative, bought the Allies time. Time to fortify the approaches to Villers-Bocage, time to reposition armor, time to deny the Germans the fluid offensive they desperately needed. Yet, not everyone saw it as triumph immediately. Within the ranks of British command, the engagement was initially viewed as a breach of discipline. Opening fire without authorization could have, in other circumstances, compromised a larger defensive plan. The gunner and his crew were pulled for debrief. Their commanding officer demanded to know why protocol had been ignored. The answer was brutally simple. Because the Panzers were already there. No radio signal, no distant command post, no paper doctrine could have reacted faster than the man staring down the barrel of that gun. The decision to fire wasn't made at a table. It was made in a shallow pit, through fog and steel, with survival hanging on a trigger. As the reports were compiled and examined, perspective shifted. The unauthorized action became a tactical success, a rare moment where initiative on the ground had altered the course of an entire engagement. In later briefings, senior officers would cite the event not as a disciplinary issue, but as an example of flexibility under pressure, the kind of battlefield intuition that rules can't always predict, but often depend on to succeed. For the Panzer Lehr Division, the failure at that choke point forced them to redirect, losing the element of surprise and slowing their counteroffensive toward the beaches. It didn't end their fight in Normandy, but it fractured their momentum at a crucial moment. And for one British gunner, the battle had already passed into silence. Smoke rose over the hedgerows. The gun was cold now, but the impact of his decision was only beginning to echo. In war, history often remembers generals, divisions, and grand maneuvers. But beneath every sweeping arrow on a map lies a moment like this. Quiet, brief, and made by a single human hand. The destruction of the Panzer Lehr column outside Villers-Bocage wasn't orchestrated by headquarters, nor born of a flawless battle plan. It was forged in a shallow pit, by a gun crew who understood that seconds mattered more than signatures. Their unauthorized firing pattern didn't just destroy tanks, it disrupted the rhythm of an entire German counterattack. The British 6-pounder gun had no aura of legend like the massive artillery of the front. But it was the perfect weapon for that place and that time. Low, precise, and deadly at close range. The Panther tanks, once symbols of German dominance, became trapped and vulnerable because of terrain, timing, and one man's judgment. In this moment, the rigid lines of command met the chaotic truth of the battlefield. War isn't fought in perfect coordination. It's fought in fog, in confusion, in fragments of time when the difference between victory and defeat is one decision made too soon or too late. The gunner's act didn't make headlines. His name was buried beneath reports and statistics, one entry among thousands. Yet his choice bought hours for the British line, saved lives, and shifted the local balance of the Normandy campaign. This is the quiet power of individual initiative in modern war. Doctrine sets the frame, but human instinct gives it life. And sometimes, a single unauthorized pull of a firing lever can echo louder than the plans of entire armies. As the smoke drifted away over the bocage, the battlefield fell silent. Steel husks cooled in the soft wind. The fog that had hidden the enemy now carried only the scent of burnt fuel and wet earth. And in that silence, a truth as old as war itself stood clear. History is often written not by the many, but by the few who act when no one else does. One decision, one shot, and a column of steel stopped in its tracks. If you want more untold moments like this, the small actions that shaped a world at war, subscribe and join us as we uncover the hidden battles behind history's headlines. Like, share and turn on notifications to never miss the next forgotten story of WYO.